Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's book talk hosted by the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. My name is Ling Jing. I'm a research fellow at MEI, and I'll be your host for today's session. We're very pleased to have with us Professor Jonathan Fulton, who's here to share insights from his latest book, Building the Belt and Road Initiative in the Arab World, China's Middle East Math. So please allow me to briefly introduce Professor Fulton. He's an associate professor of political science at Zaid University in Abu Dhabi, UAE, and also a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. Professor Jonathan Fulton is a leading expert on China's policy toward the Middle East and has written extensively on the topic for both academic and general audiences. His previous books include China's relations with the Gulf monarchies and the Routledge Handbook of China-Middle East Relations, and it's very helpful for my research, Professor. And to be honest, I say I'm a huge fan of Professor Fulton, and I've been reading a lot of his work and especially his China MENA newsletter, which offers sharp and timely analysis of China's engagement in the Middle East. And I believe it has become a valuable resource for scholars and policy advisors alike. So today we are very excited and honored to hear from him about his new book and the thinking behind it. About the background and the motivation for writing this book. What inspired you to conduct this research, and what are the core questions you were trying to explore?
First, thank you for the very warm and generous introduction. I hope my students were listening. And thanks again for the opportunity to speak with folks from the Middle East Institute. I always enjoy engaging in US. You guys put on great events and great reputation for excellent scholarship. So always happy to work with the MEI. So the motivation, there are a number of things. I mean, first and foremost, the this 1+2+3 cooperation framework was announced in 2014, and it was very strange to me to think a decade had passed and nobody really written very much about it in English. So it seemed like a good opportunity for me, something that had been underanalyzed. I think also we've seen over the past decade a tremendous surge in China's presence in the Middle East, China's engagement with Arab countries. There's been a lot of analysis, a lot of scholarship. Some of it has been excellent, some of it has been less so. You see a lot of politicized analysis, a lot of people who are kind of projecting geopolitical, I don't even know how to describe it, but just looking at what China's doing and saying, this is really challenging global politics and reshaping the Middle East. I've lived in the Gulf since 2006, and I don't see that, and I don't think too many people around here see that as well. So it seemed like an excellent opportunity just to look at this framework presented a way to look at China's presence in the region in a novel way, in a systematic way, just to see what China's doing here, why it's important, what developments are interesting, which ones are less developed, and that was kind of my motivation for doing this.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor, and that really sets the stage. And now we'd love to hear more about the big picture of your book and what is 1+2+3 framework. And Floyd's yours.
Excellent, thanks. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll talk about just what is this 1+2+3 framework, and then go into each of its components, and then kind of the big themes I've seen or the trends that I've seen while researching the book. And I'll try to keep it short because I'd much rather have more, longer Q&A session. So 1+2+3, like I said, this is a framework that was introduced in 2014. There's this multilateral forum called the China Arab States Cooperation Forum that's been in place for about 24 years now. It's a really interesting bellwether to look at what China's doing in the region with Arab countries. It's a very important distinction. This is with the China Arab states. It's not Middle East in general, so you don't see Israel, Iran, or Turkey. This is China working with the Arab League countries. And they have these forums every 2 years. The one in 2014, I think, was a landmark, but not really recognized as such yet. And I'll go into detail why that is, but they have these forums every 2 years. It kind of sets the stage for what China and Arab League member states plan to do over the following 2 years. And it's always a really excellent way to look at emerging trends. At the 2014 one, it was held in Beijing, and Xi Jinping gave the opening remarks. And during the opening remarks, he said we should develop the 1+2+3 cooperation framework. Now, for folks who don't spend a lot of time looking at Chinese foreign policy initiatives or general policy initiatives, these numbered things like the 3 represents or the 4 uns or the 1+2+3 or one belt, one road, it sounds a little unusual to an English ear, but I assume in Chinese it sounds better. You find a lot of these numbered initiatives. 1+2+3, when it was announced, created each number represented one sector that China was going to focus on in developing relations with Arab countries. One was called Energy at the Core. It's looking at traditional hydrocarbons. 2 is the 2 wings, and by this it's the trade investment and infrastructure construction. And 3 is the 3 breakthroughs, and this is nuclear energy, renewable energy, and space satellite. So if you look at what China had been doing with Arab countries prior to 2014, you'd see that each of these were already developed at a pretty, uneven. Energy, of course, was very important. Infrastructure is very important. Trade was. These are things that China was already targeting. And this just kind of created a framework. It created a way for Chinese SOEs, for Chinese lending institutions, for Chinese municipalities, provinces to say, look, this is a priority for the federal government. We're going to use this as a way to get funding or to get momentum for projects. So it was announced in 2014. It also was featured in the 2016 China-Arab policy paper, which coincided with Xi Jinping's state visit to Iran, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. This paper was released and also said, focus on this 1+2+3 as a way to develop relations with Arab countries. Now, I mentioned, I emphasize the Arabness of it, and that you don't see Iran, Israel, or Turkey in this, but you'll also see similar patterns of engagement. Chinese SOEs, Chinese private businesses focusing on these things are doing the same in those 3 countries, maybe not as deeply. There are political constraints or geopolitical constraints with each of them, which I discuss also in the book. But you do see very similar patterns of engagement across the entire region. Now, a little context, I think the timing is really important for this. As I said, it was introduced in 2014. Of course, in 2012, Xi Jinping became he became the leader in China. And almost immediately, we start to see a lot of really significant changes in China's international posture. The biggest, of course, was in 2013, the Silk Road Economic Belt and the Maritime Silk Road Initiative were both announced and then consolidated as One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative. The Silk Road Economic Belt was a project to promote engagement with Eurasian countries, mostly Central Asia. The Maritime Silk Road Initiative was a framework for developing closer ties to primarily Southeast Asia. And when it became the One Belt, One Road, you could see it expanded and came to incorporate more countries, more regions. But it's just a few months later, after all these things were announced, that this 1+2+3 was rolled out. And altogether, you see it signaled a bigger, more ambitious international presence for China. Up until this point, it's hard to remember, way back in, say 2012, when there were still debates, is China truly a global power? David Shambaugh published this book in 2013, China's a Partial Power, where he said, if you look at all the different indicators of power, whether it's military, economic, soft power, political, diplomatic, he made the case that China really wasn't a global power at that point, that it was still quite limited in its ability to project its power, defend its interests globally. And that was a pretty common narrative, that was 11 years ago, 12 years ago. A lot has changed since then. But obviously at this point, you could see China had really grown into a more comfortable way of talking about itself as a global power. During the reform era, of course, the hide and buy dictum of Deng Xiaoping was the way we generally looked at China's international presence, to keep more of a modest approach. Under Xi Jinping, it became Fin Fai Your Way, which was, be proactive in seeking achievements. And so we could see just a much more ambitious China starting around this period. Of course, this had been building. You can go back to the Jiang Zemin era when the go out policy had really started to put this in motion, where Chinese national oil companies and state-owned enterprises had come, particularly to the Middle East, and developed a much bigger presence. But really, it really, I think, more formally or systematically came together during this period of the past decade or so. Now, in each of these, one of my motivations, you asked about my motivation for the book. I live in Abu Dhabi. I've lived in the Gulf since 2006. My first book was about China GCC. I write a lot about China in the Gulf. And I had this sense that maybe I've been missing bigger trends, that maybe there were things happening in the broader Middle East that my kind of Gulf-centered focus was missing out on. So I thought, if I look at each of these elements of the 1+2+3, maybe I'm going to see things, like kind of unexpected surprises, that there are countries or subregions where China is doing more than I thought. So that was another one of my motivating factors, was just to think, okay, is China doing, is it expanding its presence in North Africa in a way that hasn't really been analyzed much yet? Or is China doing more in the Levant than it looks at first blush? So I looked at each of these elements, energy, trade, investment, infrastructure, renewables, satellites, and nuclear energy, and basically just measured data across all of the Arab countries to see which countries are doing the most with China, which countries see a biggest Chinese presence, which ones have the most room to enhance this, and just what are the bigger trends. So when I looked at energy, of course, this region, the Gulf, dominates. If you look at China's largest energy trade partners in the Middle East, it's dominated by the Gulf. Saudi's number one, Iraq is number two, Oman is three, UAE and Kuwait are the next ones. Iran, depending on the data we look at, is in there someplace. Official data, it's not going to feature too high. Ghost fleet data, of course, is going to be much higher. But really what you see in terms of oil trade, the Gulf is the story. Now, China does buy a lot of oil from Egypt, comparatively not that much relative to Gulf countries, but its oil trade dominates its imports, the volume of imports from Egypt and Libya as well. But these are very, very low numbers, compared to what it does with the Gulf. So what you see in this energy at the core, in terms of oil and LNG imports, it's all the Gulf. There are other countries trying to do more, but obviously that basket of 5 countries I mentioned and Qatar are the ones that are the most significant. And you see this in terms of investment, Chinese investment into energy sectors. It's still at quite a nascent level, where China is investing quite a lot into Iraq and a little bit into the UAE. Other countries have more barriers into investing into their energy sectors. That's what you see, right? Is most of the energy trade is taking place here. This creates, I think, a lot of political questions, security questions. When Xi rolled out the Arab policy paper, it did highlight cooperating on energy security, which was taken to mean securing energy shipments from exporting countries to China. So I do discuss this a little bit in the chapter. But what you see, I think, for most folks who've been looking at China and the Middle East systematically, it's not really playing a very significant role in any security issues. That's one of the themes that came through the most in this book, was that it's very much an economic-driven story. We tend to look at diplomatic or military power projection. We just don't see it. What's happening is a lot of economic engagement, and everything else is secondary at most. Looking at the two wings, this was really interesting. I started with the go out policy, as I mentioned, in the Jiang Zemin era in the 90s. You could see a big role for Chinese state-owned enterprises in the Middle East, emerging role for Chinese private companies in certain countries, like the UAE, for example, or increasingly in Saudi. But the big story, I think, here is just this alignment, especially in infrastructure construction, an alignment between China's Belt and Road cooperation priorities and Middle Eastern or Arab development agendas. In a lot of Middle Eastern countries over the past decade plus, there have been these vision development agendas, the Saudi Vision 2030, the New Kuwait 2035, the Egypt Vision 2030. And there's a tremendous synergy between what the countries in the Arab world are trying to achieve in terms of development, primarily in infrastructure development, and what China's trying to do with the Belt and Road Initiative. So you could see after 2013, when the BRI was announced, a big surge in engagement, especially in development and in construction. Chinese SOEs have really taken off in the region over this past decade. And what you see, of course, again, is the Gulf is kind of ground zero for this. GCC countries absolutely dominate, although they have the least pressing need for development, but they also have, of course, the ability to fund a lot of development projects. This is a part of the story I think that would be maybe most interesting for a lot of people. There's always an assumption that lesser developed Arab countries or countries that have had conflict, you'll see a bigger Chinese presence in this contracting. And it's just not the case. So if you look at what China's done in Syria or Yemen or Libya, it really fell off a cliff around the time of the Arab Spring. It hasn't really recovered. There's been a lot of speculation that will change, but what you see is very risk-averse companies saying, why would we go to Libya or why would we go to Lebanon in a region or a country where security is not guaranteed, if we can go to Saudi and make a fortune developing these magnificent projects in a very stable environment. So the construction contracting, the countries that have seen the most, and this I think is very interesting, the top five, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Algeria, Iran, and Egypt are the countries that have paid out the most in Chinese and contracting to Chinese SOEs. And each of those countries are at the comprehensive strategic partnership level, which is the highest rung in China's diplomatic hierarchy. And why I think this is interesting, I've talked about China's strategic partnership diplomacy quite a lot over the years. Some folks like Dugong Sun, for example, at Fudan has written about this as well, to great effect, and has shown why this is important. A lot of people have been a little dismissive because we know what an alliance is. We don't necessarily know what a strategic partnership is. The scholarship on strategic partnerships is very fuzzy. The conceptualization of it is very fuzzy. But what you see in China's strategic partnerships in the Middle East is at this highest level, comprehensive strategic partnership, the countries that have that designation have political mechanisms that enhance or facilitate economic cooperation in a lot of different areas. So what you see, what I saw, the data shows that after signing these comprehensive strategic partnerships, Egypt, UAE, Saudi, you just saw just a huge spike in the volume of contracting. So, for example, if you look at the 10 years before Egypt signed this CSP, this comprehensive strategic partnership with China, they had done $4.3 billion worth of contracting. You look at the 10 years post comprehensive strategic partnership, that quadrupled to $16.6 billion. You saw a similar dynamic in the UAE and in Saudi, where the political mechanisms inherent to these partnership agreements really facilitate Chinese companies going into these markets and really doing a lot of business. So that was, I thought, a pretty interesting way to look at these this infrastructure construction and trade and investment as well, because you see a similar dynamic where countries that have the most advanced political relationships typically also have the most advanced economic relationships. And those tend to be countries like the ones I've been talking about, the countries that are the most stable, that are the most prosperous, and interestingly, the ones that typically have close relationships with the US as well. So you don't see China doing as much with these kind of revisionist countries in the Middle East. There's a preference for working with more status quo oriented ones. The three breakthroughs I thought was also, to me, that was the chapter I was really looking forward to researching, because they're sectors you just don't see much about, right? Nuclear energy, renewable energy, and space satellites, pretty hot topics. They're also very sensitive because, in their own ways, they challenge the normative dominance of the West in general and the U.S. in particular. The idea that China could become a significant actor in space satellites using Beidou navigation systems really could challenge the dominance of GPS. So when you're seeing Middle Eastern countries engaging with China in these more technologically focused sectors, this has the potential to really have a pretty big impact, I think. Now, nuclear, what you see, obviously within China, there's been a pretty significant growth in China's domestic nuclear capacity and over the past decade. It's projected to be the biggest nuclear energy producer. Within the next 10 years, it's a close second to the US now, I believe. And as it's been developing its domestic capacity, it's been working to export its nuclear tech and know-how to international markets. And what you see in the Middle East is a lot of countries that have a need for alternative energy sources, especially those countries that have, with global warming or climate change, with countries that actually produce a lot of energy but sell it. There's been this need to develop homegrown sources of energy. Nuclear, you see, especially in the UAE, has been quite advanced in this to develop a bigger domestic nuclear energy program. Saudi has been trying very much over the past 15 years to develop this as well. Still, it's kind of a limited niche market. And in this, you see traditional partners like the US, Russia, South Korea dominating, France as well. China has made limited inroads in cooperation with the Emirates, with Algeria. Egypt tends to be more focused on cooperating with Russia on this. And Saudi has been flirting with China a lot over the past 7 or 8 years. But of course, I think the preference for Saudi is to work with the US on this, and it's being bundled into a larger security cooperation agreement. I think probably that's what we're going to see is what China's options for working with Saudi are probably going to be pretty limited, probably mostly with research facilities and exchange and things like this. In terms of Beidou space satellite, also kind of limited in the Middle East so far. There's been a forum developed, the China Arab States BDS Cooperation Forum. They've met 3 times. The most recent time was in Alexandria in 2023. But these forums seem to be quite modest in their outcomes. The biggest one so far has been in Tunis, where they created a BDS center, a training center. There's been some scholarships offered to Arab students to go to China and study, to work with Beidou, but it's also been quite marginal at this point. Iran has probably been the biggest market for this. And then in renewables, well, this is a big success story, as everywhere. Whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's anything, this part of the chapter. It could have been a standalone book. What China's doing in renewable energy in the Arab world is really significant, and you can see, especially in the U.S. current administration as it's been undermining its own capacity to be a significant actor in this. China's making a lot of inroads, and just here in the UAE, there's such an appetite to develop this sector, and you see it across the Arab world, and in affiliated technologies like electric vehicles, China's been making such tremendous gains in the region. So this one I think is really one to keep an eye on. It's I think the story that a lot of people haven't been paying enough attention to. When we think of China in the Middle East, of course we think about traditional hydrocarbons. Of course we think about trade and investment. We think about infrastructure. I think what's most interesting to Arab governments, especially, is how can you help us solve our development problems, and how can you help us crack into these renewable energies? And China's been doing very well in that. Now, I did look at in my concluding chapter at what China does with Iran, Israel, and Turkey. And I mentioned in the introduction that there are kind of geopolitical or domestic pressures that limit the opportunity for these countries to do a lot. With Israel, it's obvious. Israel is never going to be cleaved away from the US. And obviously, everything we've seen since October 7th, 2023, China is very much aware of this. China uses Israel as a cudgel. It also uses it as a way to develop a stronger, I guess, more of a stronger ties to the Arab League countries that tend to look at Chinese narratives about the Israel-Palestine issue. China's narrative tends to be designed, I think, with the so-called Arab street in mind. I don't know how effective that is politically, but I think it does put a limit on what China can do with Israel. With Iran, the limits I think are also pretty significant. There's a lot of hype. I think people look at China and Iran and see, this axis of upheaval, these revisionist powers that are going to undermine regional or global order in cahoots with Russia and North Korea. I've made this point time and again. If you look at China's presence in the Middle East, its most significant partners, its most significant economic interests are with Iran's rivals. And of course, China's always going to, it's in China's interest for the Iranian regime to remain. Nobody in China wants to see regime change take place in Tehran, which I think is also the general consensus in most of the Arab world as well. But I also think that China finds Iran a very problematic partner that undermines a lot of China's interests in the region. And with Turkey, it was interesting as well because, with Turkey, what you see is this tension where the Turkish government would love to do more with China, but it also has to address the Uyghur issue. And this creates tensions for Turkish political actors who have to thread that needle. How can we speak to the Chinese government while also speaking to Uyghurs and addressing that concern, because the Uyghurs are an ethnically Turkic people. And I think that also puts a bit of a ceiling on what they're able to do beyond, the typical trade and typical investment. Anyhow, that's generally what the book is about. The key ideas. What I'd love to do is to hear, any of I know you had some questions for me. If people in the audience have any questions, I'd love to hear what people are wondering about these days.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your informative and insightful presentation. I got a lot of things in mind, and I do have a list of questions to ask. And so let's now moving to the Q&A session. And if any one of our audiences has a question, please feel free to type in their Q&A box. You can find it in the Zoom launch, and so that we can read it out. And while we are waiting for the questions, I'm going to, in Chinese we say, to throw away a brick to get a gem. You know that saying. It's like to start the discussion, and I'd like to ask a few of my questions, and also You mentioned in your presentation that unlike a lot of people's assumptions that China is seeking opportunities in less developed or undeveloped countries, China actually preferred to do business with the rich countries in the Gulf, for example, like the Gulf and with UAE, Saudi Arabia. And can we interpret it from another way? It's like, is it because of the stability? So because like China always places emphasis on stability and on regional security or stability in the Middle East, and um, those countries who can provide a more stable and more secure environment for the business will be more attractive to China. And but given the the recent tensions or instabilities in the region, like you said, since October 7, 2023, and the recent one, the conflict or war between Iran and Israel. So we can see that the region right now maybe is less stable as a while ago. So how do you think this might impact the 1+2+3 cooperation pattern? So do you think will China reconsider or adjust its priorities in the Arab world or
No,
and
I mean, I think you're right. Political stability and
Mhm,
and actual physical security
mhm,
are big motivating factors. And you could see this just in the end of June during the war between Israel and Iran. Um, Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs said they had between 2,000 and 3,000 Chinese nationals living in Iran that they had to try to evacuate. That was interesting because I hadn't really seen any data on Chinese expats in Iran. I knew it was quite modest. I didn't realize it was that modest. Um, the Chinese ambassador to the UAE gave a speech last year, and he said that their best estimate is that there are about 400,000 PRC nationals living in the UAE right now. Now, the UAE's population is about 10 million. Iran's population is about 90 million. Um, that tells you something, that 400,000 people are living here and 2,000 people are living there. And I think a lot of it is for the exact reason you described. Like if you can come to a country and you have a very stable market, you have nice schools for your kids to live in. You don't have to worry about security problems. Um, of course, that's going to be a much more attractive destination. And you see the same dynamic. I mean, the UAE is an outlier just because it is by far the biggest Chinese population in the region. But typically, what you see is, people, not just Chinese, but everybody, given the choice, they're going to live in a country where they have, less risk. And the biggest Chinese populations are in places like here in Saudi and Kuwait and Qatar, um, and Egypt is a big one as well. But in places where there's a big, lack of security, you just don't. Egypt, Syria, Yemen, Libya, there's just not much happening there, and it makes economic sense. It makes sense in any number of ways. And I think it just really reflects, that a lot of what China's doing here really is more economic focused rather than geopolitical focused, right? That it's mostly SOEs and private companies trying to go to markets where they think they're going to have an impact.
yeah, I agree with you. Um, you also mentioned it like Egypt, Iran, these places, and they are still facing risks and instability, and also some domestic politic issues. So I feel that Chinese, especially those companies, say the national companies and the big companies are very cautious to enter the markets. And in your book, you've written about how China deals with different sub regions in different ways. And so, um, how do you see China's so-called balanced approach between Iran and the other Gulf states, as you mentioned, that they are mostly most of the time rivals, and you also, I remember you also described China's relationship with Iran is the most complicated one in the Middle East. So it could be a big problem. So how do you think, is it sustainable that China using this balanced approach, or will be any change in?
Well, so I'm an international relations guy. So when we talk about balance, we're usually talking about balancing power. But I think in this case, we're talking about balance as, trying to avoid alienating any one country. And I think that will remain the case. I think, I can't presume to speak for the Chinese government or any officials, but I think if they look at Iran, they see, a potentially very lucrative market, full of really smart, ambitious people that, live in a state that is poorly governed and limits their opportunities to do things. So I think they look at Iran and think, well, someday things might change there. Let's try to keep a good relationship with Iran. Um, but I don't think it's balanced in terms of what China does with Iran compared to what China does with Saudi or the UAE or Oman. There is no balance. It tilts so heavily in favor of the GCC countries, and it's not even close. Um, for Iran, it really is a matter of, I think in any relationship, asymmetry is going to be one of the most important features when you're looking at China's international relations. And of course, that's very much the case in the Middle East, where there's no country that has the kind of power, size, economy of China. Um, but it really kicks in with Iran because Iran needs China. Iran doesn't have any other economic partner that can do what China is willing to do for Iran. The other countries, not so much. Like of course, Saudi and the UAE and Kuwait and Oman need a market for their energy. But everybody needs energy. They'll sell to India, they sell to Japan, they sell to Korea. There's a lot of countries to sell this product to. It creates a more of I would say a more balanced relationship between China and the GCC countries, where between China and Iran, it's very imbalanced, right? It's very much a case of Iran needing China in a way that China doesn't need Iran. That said, I think China is going to continue looking at the region. A lot of the issues shaping these dynamics we're talking about are the result of this Western imperial period that came into the Middle East and created the modern state system, and the relationship between Iran and the rest of the world, I think is largely a legacy of that as well. Obviously the revolution and the very, very bad government that they have drives it, but I think China looks at Iran and thinks, hey, like we didn't have a hand in creating this tension between Iran and its neighbors, or Iran and the West, or Iran and the US. Like they don't see Iran the same way that the West does, right? They don't see it as a country that's that has fought against American troops and killed American troops and sponsored terrorism in the West, because it hasn't played out the same way for the China-Iran relationship. So I think when China looks at Iran, they think, okay, we get that it's a troublesome partner. We get that it undermines a lot of our broader interests. But by maintaining a pretty positive, functional relationship with Iran, China's interests are probably going to be met in some capacity. That said, again, just to reemphasize, I don't think that means there's a balance, because obviously what China does with Iran's rivals is much more substantial and much more important.
I remember during the Iran-Israel war, I was asked several times by some local media, and it's like what China will do for Iran. So I guess some of their assumption comes from like China was a close ally to Iran, but actually, as you just explained it, it's not what we imagine. And and I say that in short term, I feel that what China can do for Iran is to keep the economic ties with Iran and to prevent that Iran will not collapse economically. So because, last time when we saw a Middle Eastern country collapse economically, what happened next? A lot of terrorist group organizations showed up, and chaos, and the situation will be very terrible. So I agree with you that China has done much more substantial things with other countries like the Iran's rivals countries. So okay, so we can see from the Q&A box, and this colleague from the East Asian Institute, Dr. Yu Hong, has sent 2 questions. And actually, the first one is quite relevant to my 3rd question, and I'm going to combine it with mine. So I'm going to ask you, it's like the GCC welcomes China's growing engagement with the region, but carefully balances its against its engage balances its against long-standing strategic and security ties with the West in general and the United States in particular. So that's basically about the rivalry between China and the U.S. in the region. The power competition in the region, and it's about the rivalry between the U.S. and China. And so, also, I'd like to ask you, how do the GCC countries play the balance of power game between China and the West? And my question is, do you see China's engagement is competitive, or is it complementary with U.S. influence in the Arab world?
Yeah, so it's interesting because when you were talking about China and Iran and the war with Israel in June, I was going to jump in. But this question kind of comes back to the point I was going to make. There was an assumption China would do more for Iran because it's often described as an ally of Iran, and the PRC has a pretty strict non-alliance policy that's been in place since 1982.
Exactly, non-interference policy. It's quite a long-standing strategy.
So there's that, but the non-alliance is just, when Chinese leaders talk about alliances, they often talk about a Cold War mentality and bloc politics, and alliances target a third country. The international relations literature on alliances talks about the alliance security dilemma, that the more powerful country has the fear of entrapment, and the weaker country has the fear of abandonment. And in China's case, it's the fear of entrapment, the idea that if they make a formal alliance with Iran and they're actually on the hook to support Iran in a conflict, then what's to stop Iran from being more aggressive to say, hey, we're going to start poking against other countries because we know China's got our back. So China makes it very clear, we're not going to play that game. You're not going to get any kind of security commitment from us. Our partner, or China's partnership diplomacy, focuses on areas of mutual interests. It's mostly about building trust and focusing mostly on economic issues and putting security on the back burner. And that comes back to the GCC question about, the China-US Gulf Triangle. Gulf countries are very prosperous and live in a very competitive and fractured region. And one of the main approaches has always been to have strong ties to extra-regional powers to help maintain their security. And that was the UK, it was the US. It's always been the case. China's made it very, very clear, you're not going to get that kind of an arrangement with the PRC. China's very happy to cooperate on development, trade, investment, energy, and these new global initiatives, global development, global civilization, to develop consensus on global governance. But Gulf countries, and I think Arab countries in general, know that China's not going to step in if there's actually a hard security concern. And I published a paper. I was asked by the UK Ministry of Defense last fall. They'd seen a lot of enhanced Chinese diplomatic presence in the region, and they're wondering, does that correlate with regional perceptions of China as a partner? Are people starting to see China as a more robust actor in political security, diplomatic issues? So to write this, I spoke with folks from a lot of different Middle Eastern countries, and the word that kept coming up was transactional, right? The idea was, yes, China's important to us in certain sectors, but also we realized that after October 7th, for example, when you saw attacks on the Red Sea shipping, when you saw attacks, conflicts between Israel, Hezbollah, Israel, Houthis, Israel, Hamas, China didn't have the solution in this case. China's narrative of a more normative approach to security, this peace through development, doesn't really address a lot of the pressing issues in the region. So most countries realize, hey, China's great for us to work with on certain things, but it's not the one-stop shop that the US has been, right? Where you get tech, where you get AI, where you get military transfers, where you get military training, where you get all the stuff that the partnership with the US or the alliance with the US provides. So I think there's a ceiling on how most countries in the region see China in respect to or in comparison with the US. Now, of course, for a lot of us who come from countries like I'm Canadian, we've long been, the US alliance has been the foundation of a lot of our international politics and defense and security policies. And under the current administration, a lot of that's being questioned. So I think a lot of countries have to wonder, how reliable is the US right now in this space? And I think in the Gulf, people seem genuinely satisfied, right? That they know that they can, buy a lot of tech from the US and they can cooperate with the Trump administration pretty easily. It doesn't come with the same pressures that maybe folks from NATO countries or Korea or Japan might face. So I think typically the GCC countries remain pretty satisfied, knowing that they're going to get a lot more from the US than they're going to get from China. I don't think it's a matter of them using China wholesale to try to get better terms from the US. I think there are certain things that China does really well. Like I said, EVs or renewables. And you're going to see China as the preferred partner in some of those sectors. And then in other sectors like AI, for example, we saw this during the Trump visit to the Gulf in the spring, where they're going to say, look, we can afford the best in class, and the best in class is going to be Microsoft or whoever. We're going to work with the US on this. So I think they've prioritized certain sectors or certain issues, and it's kind of like a la carte. We'll pick some things from China, we'll pick some things from the US, some things from the European, some things from India.
Yeah, and speaking of the AI and tech corporations, is there anything underwater? I just shoot directly. So it's not every story is like the G42 story, like the GCC countries prefers American technologies, and they have to abandon China's ties, but as you mentioned, there are like a lot of people for 40 million people. Sorry, what was the number? The Chinese people living in the UAE.
Oh, 400,000.
400,000, sorry, 400,000 people living in the UAE. And I don't believe all of them are doing small business. And there must be like high tech, like workers and those companies and collaborated with local UAE tech companies and is there anything, do you think is there anything like underwater and they are like trying to transpass the US sanction? I know this question is a little bit a little bit
No,
far-fetched, but I'm just very curious. Yeah.
no, not at all. I think so. There are a lot of Chinese tech companies operating here,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of Chinese experts working here.
Mm-hmm.
There's still a lot of opportunities, I think, in
Mm-hmm.
that space. Now, G42 is different in that it's a major source of government contracts in
Mm.
this, and that brushes up against a lot of you know so-called critical tech infrastructure,
Mhm.
and in that space. G42 has made it very clear we're going to work with the US on that.
Mm-hmm.
G42 is not the only company, right? There are other smaller companies or entities that are doing, AI projects in the region that aren't necessarily going to be things that involve, critical infrastructure, critical tech. And so you find a lot of Chinese businesses doing a lot here. I talk to Chinese working in the UAE all the time. And you're right. I mean, they're not just people working for, big SOEs. You see everybody, whether they're profs or small business owners or anything, it's a very diverse and interesting dynamic. So, not far from where I am right now, I'm on campus at Zayed University. There's a part of Abu Dhabi called Masdar City, which is a carbon neutral place here. And you find a lot of tech companies that have set up shop there. There's a lot of Chinese nationals working there. You see the same thing if you go to in Dubai. There's just a huge Chinese tech ecosystem here. So it's not a matter of G42 divested itself of all Huawei and Chinese AI companies, and now all Chinese AI is dead here. It's just there's a limit on what they're willing and able to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's a red line, right?
Yeah, there are red lines, and I think that was a question that a lot of folks around the Middle East had for the US during the first Trump administration and the early Biden administration. You know, what is the red line?
Mm-hmm.
Tech. You can't say we can't work with China on
Mm-hmm.
anything tech related. Everything is tech. And I think, to their credit, I think the US government heard that message and realized that they needed a more realistic approach and kind of set the parameters in a way that people here realize these are things we can do, these are things that will be more problematic or that will limit our ability to work with American partners if we do this with Chinese partners. And I think that's actually a pretty reasonable,
Mm-hmm.
starting point.
Thank you so much. So let's look at the second question by Dr. Yu Hong. This one is about the debt issue. Many BRI countries are concerned about the debt onto China associated with BRI projects in the Arab world context. How serious is this debt issue for the GCC countries, if any?
It's not for GCC countries directly. GCC countries are incredibly wealthy, and so the debt trap narrative, I think, was interesting. If you look at Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, or if you look at things
Egypt.
in Egypt or sub-Saharan Africa, where the debt ratio was really skewed towards Chinese projects, that was disruptive. Those countries didn't necessarily have a lot of options. I remember the former director at MEI came on my podcast, Bilahari Kazakan, and talked about the problems of local corruption in certain countries that create conditions where this debt trap is more likely to take place, and it's not necessarily a matter of predatory approaches from the PRC so much as opportunity and motive, right? Like if you go into a place where there's a very corrupt government and they throw a lot of money at a company, of course the company's going to take it, and then you get a problem. Now, Gulf countries, because they're so wealthy and because they're much more transparent, they have options. They don't need Chinese infrastructure construction. They can turn to Germany, or they can turn to Japan, or they can turn to any number of providers. And it's really about who gives us the best terms and who gives us the best quality. And if the price point is different, we don't care because we can afford it, right? I think there's a big issue of status where if you can afford the best, then you want the best because it shows that you are at a different level. Interestingly, however, I remember at an event in a GCC country where a retired minister spoke about this issue. And he said, of course, we're not worried about debt. It doesn't affect us directly. It affects us indirectly, where if you see Iraq or Egypt, taking out significant loans that they don't have the capacity to pay back, this is going to destabilize those countries' economies, and then they're going to need to be bailed out by somebody. Who are they going to come to? Probably us. And if you have a destabilized Arab country, that creates a lot of political problems for its neighbors. So this former minister's point was that trap, there is an indirect spillover effect that can brush up against the GCC in other ways. So at that point, I think this was 2022 when he made this observation to me. I think what you've seen, there's a big UAE loan to Egypt last year, and I think part of the logic is based on that idea that if outside lenders are creating these loans that are politically potentially problematic, it's going to blow up on us eventually. So let's get in front of it and try to solve it first.
Okay, we've seen another question coming in the Q&A box. This is from Raphael Andrew. In the last few years, Xi has followed up the 1+2+3 framework with a few more numbered policy orientations, notably the 8 major joint actions. Okay, the 8 major joint actions for practical China-Arab cooperation, and there's a 5 cooperation frameworks between China and Arab states. And do you think these frameworks reflect an actual evolution of any change in terms of China's priorities, or is it mainly a question of optics with 1+2+3 still consistent? Constituting the main thrust of China's engagement. So is there any new development in the framework?
Man, one book at a time, Raphael. Yeah, I think it's I think the first point about evolution in terms of priorities is probably, you know, um, reflective of what this is about, right? These are the 1+2+3. This is kind of a top-down branding. Like I said, these were things that Chinese companies were already doing in the region, and it was kind of all bunched together in this package to say this is the framework. These are the things we're going to support. You know, that's not unusual. That's the same as BRI, right? Like when the BRI was announced, if you saw how China was working with Pakistan or with Central Asia, it was already doing most of these cooperation priorities. This is just a way to frame things to make it easier for Chinese actors to get support or funding or whatever. Now, in terms of evolving priorities, what you see is a lot of times these top-down directives come out. Some are successful and some aren't. And obviously there's a recalibration. I think having research for this book, like I remember in 2017 reading so many articles about Saudi China nuclear cooperation, that they're going to be using Chinese companies are going to contracts for water desalination through nuclear technology, and that they're going to be helping mine uranium, and all this stuff was happening. And then, whatever it was, 6 to 7 years later, there's very little that's actually transpired. The same thing with Oman and Duqm, which was a huge story, again, in 2016, 2017, that China's going to this port and, investing something like $11 billion. And several years later, what you see is most of China's projects in Oman are happening in the Sahar free zone. Duqm doesn't really carry the same weight. So I think what happens is these projects or initiatives get rolled out. They're confronted by the reality that conditions on the ground don't always support them. That maybe it wasn't as well planned as hoped, or maybe things change, and you see an evolution where different things come to the fold. Like I said, nuclear, I think is there's such a limited space for China to make inroads into that. But what we've seen in the past 3 or 4 years is just this explosion of Chinese electric vehicles across the region. If they were making the 1+2+3, I'd imagine, that sector would be part of the 3, like to focus on exporting Chinese and manufacturing Chinese EVs across the region.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you once again, and we have exhausted our time. Thank you, Professor Fulton, for such a rich and insightful discussion. And I see your work offers a very valuable framework for understanding China's role in the Middle East. And I'm sure today's audience has taken away a lot to think about. So for our audience, if you want to keep the conversation going, purchase a copy of Professor Fulton's book. And thank you so much for everyone who joined us today. And we really appreciate your time and engagement. And we hope to welcome you to our MEI events in the future. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you so much.